In the high valleys of northwestern Montana, during the long, hot summer of 1919, people started talking about Arthur Jensen. They didn't talk about his service in the Great War, or the quiet way he and his wife Clara kept to themselves. They talked about the hole. All summer long, with a borrowed team of mules and his own two hands, Jensen was digging. Not a root cellar, not a well. He was digging a massive rectangular pit, 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, right where a man was supposed to build a house. Neighbors would ride past on the county road, slow their horses, and just stare. They saw a man digging his own foundation, but he just kept going down. 5 feet, 6, 8 feet deep into the Montana soil. They thought he'd lost his mind. The war addled him, they'd say at the trading post, building a grave for his family and calling it a home. And when the winter of 1919 hit, a winter so brutal it would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between mere survival and actual living. It would become the warmest, safest, most efficient home in the entire valley. If you want to hear the number, the exact temperature that made the county's most experienced builder go silent and admit he'd been wrong for 30 years, stay until the end. What did this quiet newcomer, a man who'd spent 4 years in the muddy trenches of France, understand about the Montana earth that every logger, rancher, and builder in the valley had missed for half a century? If you enjoy these stories of quiet competence, consider subscribing and drop a comment below. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. Arthur Jensen wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 34-year-old former sergeant in the Army Corps of Engineers, and all he wanted was to keep his family from shivering. His experience in the war had not been in combat, but in construction under fire. He had spent years digging, timbering, and shoring up the earth, creating command posts, field hospitals, and shelters deep in the ground. These weren't just trenches. They were subterranean structures designed to withstand the shock of artillery, but also, as he learned, to remain remarkably stable in temperature, insulated by the deep, silent earth from the biting French winters. He understood soil, drainage, and the immense thermal mass of the ground beneath his feet. He and Clara, along with their 2 young children, Lily and Sam, had arrived in the valley the previous year. They bought a small plot of land with a standard log cabin on it. By frontier standards, it was a respectable home. The logs were sound, the stone fireplace drew well, and they'd spent the autumn chinking every last gap with mud and moss. It looked solid, it looked warm. Then their first winter came, the winter of 1918, and it was a brutal education. The Montana wind was a physical presence. It was a relentless thief, pulling heat from the cabin walls day and night. Arthur burned through 8 cords of wood, a staggering amount for such a small structure. He was up every 3 hours in the dead of night, feeding the stove, yet the cabin never felt truly warm. The suffering was specific, a collection of miserable daily details. His daughters slept in their coats, their faces peeking out from under a mountain of blankets. Clara would stuff rags along the baseboards and windowsills every evening, only to find them frozen stiff and hard as boards by morning. Frost bloomed in delicate, cruel patterns on the inside of the walls. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would be skimmed with ice by sunrise. The cabin's average temperature, even with the stove glowing red, hovered around 45 degrees. On the good days, it was a constant, exhausting, losing battle against the cold. Arthur was an engineer. He didn't see problems emotionally. He saw them as systems that were failing, and this system was failing badly. One afternoon during a lull in the wind, he was digging out a new root cellar. It was 20 below zero outside, but 10 feet down in the earth. The soil was cool, not frozen. It was stable. He realized his small, crude root cellar, with its dirt walls and simple timber roof, consistently stayed around 40 degrees, no matter what the weather did. The wind couldn't touch it. The snow that piled up against the cabin's north wall, he noticed, created a small pocket of relative warmth where the wind couldn't strip the heat away. That was the insight. The connection fired in his mind, linking the Montana prairie to the battlefields of France, the dugouts, the deep shelters. The problem wasn't his stove. It wasn't his wood. It was exposure. His cabin was like a man standing in a gale with a thin shirt. The wind was stealing the heat faster than he could generate it. His plan formed, simple in concept, radical in execution. He wouldn't build on the land anymore. He would build in it. He would use the earth itself as a shield, a massive, dense blanket that the wind could not penetrate and the cold could not easily conquer. He would build a dugout cabin. The work began in late spring. He sourced his materials with an engineer's thrift. He dismantled their existing log cabin, saving every sound log. From a decommissioned Army supply depot in the next county, he bought a stack of surplus corrugated steel sheets for $65. It was all the roofing he would need. The construction sequence was what baffled his neighbors. First came the excavation. For weeks it was just Arthur and the mules, scraping and hauling, digging the earth, creating the massive pit. To passers-by, it looked like he was digging a reservoir. Once the pit was 8 feet deep, he didn't start building against the dirt walls. This was his first piece of quiet brilliance. He laid a deep 6-inch bed of coarse river gravel across the entire floor of the pit. He learned about the importance of drainage the hard way in the perpetually wet trenches of the Western Front. Water was the enemy of any subterranean structure. The gravel bed would ensure that any moisture would have a place to go, keeping the foundation bone dry. On top of the gravel, he built a raised wooden floor with a 6-inch airspace underneath, insulating the living space from the ground itself. Then, inside the pit, he began reassembling the log cabin walls, but he didn't place them against the earthen sides of the hole. He left a 2-foot gap, an open channel of air, between his log walls and the dirt. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. And that 2-foot air gap was a thermal break. It acted as a buffer zone. The earth, deep below the frost line, maintains a relatively constant temperature, in that region around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The air gap prevented the cold, damp earth from directly touching the cabin walls, stopping moisture transfer and heat conduction in its tracks. Still, air insulates. It's the principle of a double-pane window, or a thermos bottle. The earth would keep the air in the gap at around 50 degrees, meaning his cabin walls were no longer fighting against minus 40-degree wind, but against calm 50-degree air. For the roof, he used another technique learned from building structurally sound dugouts. He constructed a heavy timber reciprocal frame that could bear an immense load. He laid the surplus steel sheets over the frame, or covered them with a layer of tar paper for waterproofing, and then did the part that made everyone certain he was a fool. He hired a neighbor to help him move tons of earth back onto the roof, burying it 3 feet deep in the very soil he had just excavated. He raked it smooth and planted native prairie grasses on top. Only the south-facing front of the cabin was left exposed to the elements. Here he built a small 16-foot-long sun porch, enclosed with cheap glass panes. It was a simple sun trap designed to catch the low winter sun and create a buffer of passive solar heat in front of his main door. When he was finished, the effect was jarring. From the north, east, and west, his home was invisible. It was just a grassy, gently sloping hill. From the road, you could see the south-facing wall with its single door and 2 windows, untucked back into the earth. A thin stovepipe poked up from the top of the hill. It didn't look like a house. It looked, as one person muttered, like a home for a badger. Total cost for the new construction, under $100. The $65 for the steel, $20 for the glass panes, and about $10 in hardware. He had recycled the rest. Clara had watched the entire process with a quiet, anxious faith in her husband. But as the neighbors' comments grew from curious whispers to open mockery, her resolve wavered. One evening, looking at the grassy mound that was now their home, she turned to him. "Arthur, people are going to think we've gone mad." He just looked at her, his voice steady. "Let them. I'm trying to keep our children warm." And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw fear. They saw strangeness. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with a visit from Calvin Drecker. Drecker owned the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in the valley over the last 30 years. He was the local authority, a man whose opinion on wood and construction was taken as gospel. He walked around Arthur's strange new home, kicking at the earthen walls, his brow furrowed with professional concern. "Arthur," he said, shaking his head slowly, "you're asking for trouble. You're going to have a condensation nightmare in there. That earth will sweat all winter. Your logs will be rotten inside a year, maybe 2. You've built a tomb, not a home." Drecker wasn't being cruel. He was offering his expert opinion based on decades of experience building conventional structures that fought the elements from above ground. Arthur's response was brief, maddeningly calm. "Perhaps. We'll see." The mockery became more public after that. At the trading post, Ben Carter, a loud, tough rancher known for his blunt talk, saw Arthur buying supplies. He bellowed, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Heard Jensen's building himself a prairie dog town. Afraid of a little wind, is he?" A few men snickered. The nickname stuck. To many in the valley, Arthur Jensen was now the prairie dog. The gossip network lit up. There were whispers after church services. Women at the quilting circle would ask Clara, with pity in their voices, if they were managing all right. Men would ride their horses a quarter-mile out of their way just to stop on the road and stare at the grassy mound, shaking their heads before riding on. Clara felt the pressure most acutely. It came to her second-hand, in conversations that went quiet when she entered the general store, in the sympathetic looks that felt more like judgment. One afternoon, she overheard a woman say to another, "It's a shame what that war did to his mind, dragging his family into a hole like that." The word stung, sharp and unfair. That night, she told Arthur, her voice tight with frustration, "They think you're broken. They think you're a fool." Then came the institutional skepticism. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, paid an official visit. He was a man who lived by books and government bulletins. He was polite, but his concern was clear. "Sergeant Jensen," he began, holding his hat in his hands, "I have building manuals from 3 different states. Cornell University, the University of Wisconsin. Nothing like this is in any of them. It's highly unconventional. I have serious concerns about ventilation and structural integrity over time." Arthur just nodded. "I understand." He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just let the man have his say. The cut that went deepest, however, came from family. Clara's brother, Thomas, a successful rancher from a neighboring county, came to visit in the fall. He took Arthur aside, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and worry. "Arthur, listen to me. People are talking. All the way over in my valley, they've heard about your situation. They're going to think you're incompetent, that you can't provide a proper home for my sister, or worse, that you're scared of the winter. It's a matter of pride, man." Arthur's response was the same as it had been to everyone: calm, level, unwavering. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas. I'm trying to keep my family warm." By October, the ridicule had settled into a kind of pity. The valley had reached its verdict. Not one person thought Arthur Jensen had built a solution. They thought he'd built a monument to his own foolishness, a strange earthen scar on the landscape. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Arthur right. It changed how people in this valley thought about shelter itself. Then November came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1919 to 1920 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It didn't arrive gradually. It fell upon the valley like a hammer. The escalation of the cold was relentless, a series of brutal numerical blows. November 20th. The thermometer dropped to -10 Fahrenheit. A normal cold snap, people thought. Time to bank the fires. December 5th, it plunged to -25, driven by a wind that howled out of the north at 30 miles an hour. This was the real cold. The fight had begun. On December 15th, the great blizzard hit. It was a 4-day siege. The temperature hovered around -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a number where the air itself feels sharp in your lungs. The wind gusted to over 50 miles an hour, creating wind chills that pushed past -70. Snow, fine and hard as sand, swirled so thick you couldn't see your own barn from your front door. It piled up in drifts 10, 12, 15 feet high, burying fences and blocking roads. And then came the duration. For 31 consecutive days, from December 10th to January 10th, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. The community began to break down under the strain. The suffering was no longer abstract. It was a montage of specific, desperate failures. The Colby Ranch, with its big, handsome 2-story house, was burning through a cord of wood every 4 days. Calvin Dreeker, trying to make deliveries, couldn't even get his sledge through the drifts to reach them. Their indoor temperature, with 2 stoves running full tilt, was 40 degrees. Ben Carter, the man who had mocked Arthur, lost a dozen head of cattle. They huddled together against a fence line and simply froze solid where they stood. Inside his own well-built cabin, the single-pane windows were coated with an inch of opaque ice on the inside. He and his family lived in a small circle of marginal warmth around their stove. The Miller family's chimney, caked with creosote from burning green wood, became blocked with ice. They were forced to put their fire out for an entire day while the outside temperature was 30 below. They huddled in a single room under every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air inside their own home. The valley was running out of seasoned firewood. People started burning fence posts, then old furniture. The local doctor was making harrowing trips on snowshoes, treating case after case of severe frostbite and pneumonia. It was a battle for survival, fought house by house, cord by cord. And then people started noticing the Jensen place. A neighbor, George Riley, was struggling through a chest-deep snowdrift trying to get to his woodpile. He paused to catch his breath and happened to look over at the grassy mound where the Jensens lived. He saw a thin, lazy wisp of smoke rising from the stovepipe. It wasn't the frantic, roaring plume of a stove being pushed to its absolute limit. It was the calm, steady smoke of a normal fire on a normal day. The image was so strange, so out of place in the landscape of desperation, that it stuck in his mind. A few days later, during a brief break in the wind, George saw Arthur Jensen step out of his front door. He wasn't wearing a heavy buffalo coat. He wore a simple wool shirt and trousers. He calmly shoveled a path to his small, protected woodshed, picked up an armload of wood, and went back inside. The whole task took maybe 10 minutes. He moved without urgency, without the frantic, hunched posture of a man fighting a mortal enemy. The sight was deeply unsettling. It didn't make any sense. While the rest of the valley was freezing, the prairie dog was acting like it was a crisp autumn day. If you're still with me, stay close, because the number that came out of this strange cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It redefined what was possible. The vindication arrived on the back of a sledge, pulled by a half-frozen man named Calvin Drecker. It was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, and the heart of the Great Freeze. Drecker was making emergency wood deliveries, checking on the families he knew were in the worst shape. He'd been to 3 cabins that morning and found families huddled together, sick and shivering, their wood piles nearly gone. He saved the Jensen place for last, assuming the family in the tomb must be on the verge of disaster. He loaded his sledge with extra cordwood and pushed through the deep snow, rehearsing the speech he'd give about getting them to a warmer shelter. He pounded on the heavy wooden door, the sound muffled by the snow and earth. He expected a long wait, a weak reply. The door swung open almost immediately. It was Clara Jensen, and the first thing that happened was the warmth. It wasn't a blast of dry, scorching air from an overworked stove. It was a wave of deep, steady, humid warmth that smelled of baking bread and roasting meat. It hit Drecker's frozen face like stepping from a blizzard into a summer kitchen. The physical shock of it made him take a step back. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight inside, and his gaze went past Clara. What he saw stopped his mind. On the wooden floor, the 2 Jensen children, Lily and Sam, were playing with wooden blocks. They were in their shirt sleeves and simple cotton dresses. Not coats, not blankets, dresses. Drecker, stunned, could only manage a stammer. "Clara, are you all right? Do you need wood?" Clara smiled, a calm, easy smile that was the most unnatural thing Drecker had seen in a month. "We're fine, Calvin, truly. Please come in out of the wind." Arthur appeared at the door behind her. "Appreciate you checking on us, Calvin, but we're managing." Drecker couldn't process it. His professional brain, his 30 years of experience, was short-circuiting. He finally found his voice. "How much are you burning, Arthur? My God, man, the Colbys are going through a cord every 4 days." Arthur paused for a moment, doing the mental math. "Well, we're using about a cord every 3 weeks," he said. "Maybe a little less." A cord every 3 weeks. The words didn't compute. Drecker was delivering a cord a week to families who were still freezing. It was impossible. He stepped inside, drawn by a need to understand. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto the wall thermometer next to the door. He walked over to it, his boots heavy with snow. He squinted, disbelieving the evidence of his own eyes. He leaned closer. The mercury was sitting clear, steady, and undeniable on 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees? Outside, the air temperature was 38 below zero. The wind was gusting to 40 miles an hour, creating a wind chill of nearly 80 below. The temperature differential between the inside of that cabin and the outside world was over 100 degrees. Drecker pulled out his own pocket thermometer, his fingers clumsy with cold. He held it up. After a few minutes, it settled at the same mark. He walked over and laid a bare hand on the interior log wall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It felt neutral, like the air in the room. Warm. The comparison data was staggering, and it was forming a brutal equation in Drecker's mind. The Colby Ranch, burning 2.5 cords a month to hold an interior temperature of 40 degrees. Ben Carter's place, burning 3 cords a month to barely stay above freezing, maybe hitting 45 near the stove. Arthur Jensen's dugout, burning half a cord a month to maintain a steady, comfortable 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. The rest of the valley was engaged in a desperate, high-stakes battle of thermodynamics, are burning massive amounts of fuel to fight the cold. Arthur Jensen had simply sidestepped the battle. He wasn't fighting the winter, he was ignoring it. This wasn't just about BTUS and fuel efficiency. It was about human dignity. The Jensen children were doing their school lessons at the kitchen table without their fingers going numb. Clara was cooking meals in a simple apron, not 3 layers of wool. The family was sleeping through the night, every night, in a warm, quiet, peaceful home. Arthur's system had turned winter from a thing to be survived into simply a season to be lived through. Calvin Drecker stood in the middle of that warm, quiet room for a long time. He looked from the playing children to the simple, steady stove to the thermometer on the wall. He was a proud man, a man whose identity was built on his expertise. He turned to Arthur, and the look on his face was one of profound, world-altering revelation. He spoke quietly, not for anyone else to hear, but as a confession to the man who had just dismantled his entire understanding of his life's work. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We've been building houses on this land for 50 years, and we've been doing it wrong." After the great blizzard finally broke, the stories began to spread, carried by men like Calvin Drecker. They were stories of impossible warmth, of shirt sleeves in January, of a wisp of smoke against a frozen sky. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, heard the rumors, and returned. This time, he didn't bring manuals. He brought calibrated thermometers and a notepad. He spent a full day at the Jensen place, measuring, documenting, and asking quiet, respectful questions. The numbers he recorded were undeniable, a set of cold, hard facts that validated everything Arthur had quietly built. The first convert was the unlikeliest of all. One afternoon, a week after Dreeker's visit, Ben Carter showed up at Arthur's door, his hat in his hands, his face etched with humility. His wife and youngest son were sick with pneumonia. His woodpile was gone. His pride was shattered. "Jensen, Arthur," he started, not meeting his eyes. "I was a fool. Can you show me how you did that?" Arthur didn't mention the prairie dog comment. He didn't gloat. He just nodded and said, "Let's take a look at your land." That summer, Arthur Jensen spent his weekends helping Ben Carter build a smaller, simpler version of the dugout, bermed on three sides against a natural hillside. The following winter, Carter's family was warm for the first time, and he used less than a third of the wood he had burned in previous years. He became the idea's most vocal apostle. The innovation spread, not through books, but through results. It became known locally as the Jensen Dugout, or the Montana Earth Home. By the next winter, 5 more families had built their own variations, digging into hillsides, piling earth against north walls. Within 5 years, over 24 such homes dotted the landscape of the county, each one a quiet testament to a better way. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, became the official documenter. He published a bulletin through the Montana State Agricultural Extension Service, a slim volume titled Subterranean Dwellings for Extreme Climates, a study of the Jensen method. It included Arthur's meticulous fuel and temperature logs, Calvin Drecker's signed endorsement, and basic schematics for construction. The bulletin slowly made its way across the northern states, from the Dakotas to Washington. What Arthur Jensen had figured out through battlefield necessity and frontier desperation anticipated the core principles of passive solar design and earth-sheltered construction by nearly 60 years. He had no formal training in architecture or thermodynamics, only a deep practical understanding of the physical world, gained in the harshest of classrooms. Years later, a young reporter from a Helena newspaper came out to interview the now legendary man about his invention. Arthur was reluctant to take any credit. He stood outside his grassy home, which now had a mature garden on its roof, and gestured to the world around them. "This isn't new," he said simply. "The principle is as old as the badger's den or the fox's burrow. It's just correct." The original Jensen home still stands. The family eventually built a larger house above ground when their children were grown, but they kept the dugout. It's used now as a guest cabin, a quiet, grassy mound on a peaceful piece of land. And to this day, it still holds a steady, comfortable temperature, cool in the blazing heat of summer and warm in the deep cold of winter. The frontier didn't reward tradition for its own sake. It didn't care about what was conventional or what your neighbors thought was proper. It had only one unforgiving metric: what worked. Arthur Jensen was never trying to be a revolutionary. He was a quiet man who paid attention, who listened to the lessons of the earth, and in doing so taught his entire community how to live not just on the land, but with it. What's the most clever, simple solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Let us know your story in the comments below, and subscribe for more proven techniques from the frontier delivered every week. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of events. The characters and names are fictional, but the principles of earth-sheltered building and the harsh realities of frontier life are very real. Thank you for watching,